picture the scene. It's November 29th, 2011. You're in Tehran. And political tensions are high. But what happens next? It just looks like pure chaos.
Total unscripted chaos, yeah.
You've got thousands of students just swarming the British embassy.
Yes.
They're shouting slogans. They're furious. And then the whole thing just breaks open. They smash through these huge iron gates and just pour into the compound.
It was a scene that, to any outside observer, it would have looked like a spontaneous riot, just a real flashpoint of anger.
Absolutely. I mean, windows are being shattered, doors kicked in, and the details from the source material are just wild. They're looting the place, grabbing expensive art, but also just random stuff.
The Pulp Fiction poster.
Yes. The source mentions they looted a Pulp Fiction movie poster right off a wall.
Yeah.
And then they drag a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II out into the courtyard, smash it, and set the whole thing on fire.
A very vivid, very theatrical display. But what makes this incident the perfect hook for our deep dive today is the twist.
Yeah.
It wasn't actually chaos, and it certainly wasn't just a random mob.
Exactly, and this reveal really sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about. This was the Besieged. This was a militia, funded, trained, and directed by the state.
And they weren't just carrying protest signs. They had banners of religious figures, pictures of Qasem Soleimani. It was organized.
It looked like a riot, but it was political theater. And that right there, that highlights the central paradox we are exploring today. We're looking at an entity, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that can act like a mob, a military, and a huge corporation all at once.
So today we're unpacking the IRGC. We're basing this on Afshon Ostovar's book, Vanguard of the Imam, which is really a seminal text on this.
And the core mission here is to answer a really tricky question. How does a single entity manage to be an army, an intelligence agency, a cultural police force, and an economic conglomerate?
It's a complex question because, usually those things are separate. In the U.S., you have the Army, the CIA, and then you have General Motors. You don't have one organization that is all three. So to understand the IRGC, we have to look at this hybrid nature. We need to look at their unique military doctrine, which is basically fighting wars outside their borders so they don't have to fight them inside, and also the internal power struggles that really define them.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Let's start with the structure, because I think most people hear Revolutionary Guard and just think, okay, that's the Iranian army. But that's not quite right, is it?
No, and that is probably the most common misconception. A fascinating fact about Iran that gets missed is that it actually has two distinct parallel militaries. You have the Artesh.
The Artesh, okay.
Yes. And their job is what you would expect from any traditional military, defending borders, protecting territorial integrity. If another country invades, the Artesh is the force that's supposed to stop them.
So they're the conventional army.
They are. But then you have the IRGC, the SIPA, and their mandate is completely different.
Different how? Is it just elite troops versus regular troops?
It's much deeper than that. Their constitutional responsibility is to defend the revolution.
The revolution itself.
And the system.
Okay, let's unpack that. Defending a system sounds a lot vaguer and potentially a lot broader than defending a physical border.
Precisely. And that ambiguity is the source of their immense power. Because the system, the theocratic rule of the supreme leader can be threatened by a foreign army, sure, but it can also be threatened by domestic protests.
Or by culture.
By corrupt culture, exactly. Or by economic instability. Because their mandate is to protect the system, they have a license to intervene anywhere. Military, politics, culture, the economy, if they see a threat, they can act.
So if the Artesh sees a tank across the border, they respond. But if the IRGC decides that, say, Western movies are a threat to the revolution, they can get involved.
They can, and they do. They get to define the threat. And if you look at the source material, this definition has just expanded massively over the last few decades. They aren't just guardians of territory, they're guardians of the ideology.
And speaking of the economy, this is where that hybrid nature really clicks into place. I mean, we don't usually associate generals with boardroom meetings about dam construction.
No, but the IRGC isn't just men with guns. They are a massive industrial conglomerate. And this is crucial to understanding why they're so hard to deal with, why they're so resilient.
So how did this happen?
It goes back to the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the late 80s. The country was devastated. You had hundreds of thousands of veterans coming back from the front. The economy was shattered. So President Rafsanjani at the time had a huge problem. What do you do with all these battle-hardened men who need jobs?
Right. I mean, you don't want them unemployed and angry, sitting around with military training. That's a recipe for a coup.
Correct. So Rafsanjani encouraged the IRGC to get involved in reconstruction. They formed something called Khatam al-Anbiya.
Khatam al-Anbiya. Sounds religious.
It means seal of the prophets, but it's actually the IRGC's engineering firm. And today, they are the largest recipient of state contracts in Iran. We're talking about massive infrastructure projects.
Like what?
They built the Karkay Dam. They built the Mashhad-Syrix Railway. They built pipelines. I mean, they're everywhere.
So the same people who might be training militias in Syria are also pouring concrete for dams back home.
Yes. And the implication of that is huge. It gives them economic autonomy. They aren't just soldiers relying on a budget from the government. They're stakeholders in the GDP. This gives them immense political leverage.
But surely that crowds out the private sector. If I'm a private construction company in Tehran, how do I possibly compete with the guys who have the guns and a direct line to the supreme leader?
You don't. That's the reality. And it has created a lot of resentment. But for the IRGC, it's about survival. It's like if the Pentagon also ran a massive construction conglomerate that built all the highways and bridges in the U.S.
That's a terrifying analogy.
And used the profits to fund its own off-the-books operations. It makes them self-sustaining. It creates a situation where you can't really disentangle the IRGC from the state anymore.
They're the spine of the state.
They really are. If you try to bankrupt the Guard, you might accidentally bankrupt the country's ability to build roads or supply water.
Okay, so they have the money, they have the political mandate. But let's talk about the military side. The source material talks a lot about a doctrine called forward defense. This seems to be the logic behind everything we see Iran do in the region.
Right. Forward defense is the key strategic rationale that drives their foreign policy. And the logic is simple but ruthless. It's better to fight your enemy in their backyard than in your own.
So the best defense is a good offense. But specifically, an offense that's conducted in, say, Syria or Iraq.
So you don't have to fight in Tehran.
Exactly. You have to remember the trauma of the Iran-Iraq War. That war was fought on Iranian soil, cities were leveled, hundreds of thousands died. The IRGC's #1 goal is to make sure that never, ever happens again.
And to do that, they don't fight like a traditional army. The source uses the term asymmetric warfare. What does that actually look like for them? Well, think about who their main adversaries are. The United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia. These are countries with high-tech, expensive, conventional militaries. Iran knows it cannot win a traditional head-to-head war.
They can't beat the U.S. Navy ship for ship.
It would be suicide. So they flip the script. They don't try to match the technology. They change the rules of the game. They rely on asymmetry.
How so?
This started back in the Iran-Iraq War. The IRGC didn't have heavy weapons, but they had people. So they used the besieged volunteers for these human wave attacks, just sheer numbers overwhelming enemy positions.
Which is just a terrifying thing to even imagine.
It is, but in a modern context, that philosophy translates to different tactics. In the Persian Gulf, for instance, instead of trying to build big destroyers, the IRGC Navy uses swarms of small, fast, lightly armed speedboats.
The swarm tactics. Hard to target, hard to stop. One speedboat isn't a threat to a carrier, but 50 of them at once.
Precisely. It creates a nightmare scenario for a conventional navy. And then, of course, there's the missile program. The IRGC Aerospace Division controls all of Iran's ballistic missiles. They view those as their strategic shield.
And there was also this idea of mosaic defense in the book. It sounded like some kind of doomsday plan.
In a way, it is. This was introduced by General Jafari. He basically decentralized the entire command structure. He created 31 provincial commands.
31? Why so many?
1 for each province and 2 for Tehran. The idea is resilience. They're planning for a worst-case scenario where the U.S. invades or decapitates the leadership. If central command in Tehran is taken out, each province is set up to fight an insurgency independently.
Without needing orders from the top.
Exactly. It's incredibly paranoid, but if you assume you're going to be invaded by a superior power, it's also strategically very smart. They see themselves as constantly under siege.
So they're dug in at home. But the part of the IRGC we always hear about in the news is the Quds Force. The source calls them the tip of the spear.
Yes. The Quds Force is the unit tasked with extraterritorial operations. Quads means Jerusalem.
Which points right back to that ideological goal, exporting the revolution.
Right. The idea was always that the Islamic Revolution wasn't just for Iran, it was for the whole Muslim world. The Quds Force is the mechanism for that. And you really can't talk about the Quds Force without talking about Qasem Soleimani.
The book describes him as a living martyr even before he died. He was practically a celebrity general.
He was the architect. He built what we now call the axis of resistance. But what's so fascinating is how he did it. The IRGC doesn't just send Iranian troops to occupy a country that's expensive, it's unpopular. It looks like an invasion.
So what do?
They clone themselves.
They clone themselves. What does that even mean?
Look at Iraq. After the U.S. invasion in 2003, there was a massive power vacuum. So the IRGC used the Badr Corps. These were Iraqi exiles they had trained during the Saddam era and just moved them right in to fill that vacuum.
So they use locals, but locals trained and loyal to them.
And they structure them like their own Basij. It's brilliant in its effectiveness. You take local grievances, you provide money, training, ideology, and suddenly you have a force loyal to Tehran operating in Baghdad.
And it wasn't just Iraq.
No. Syria is the prime example. The source actually calls Syria the 35th province of Iran.
Wait, the 35th province? That's a huge claim. That makes it sound as important as one of their own provinces.
It is existential for them. If the Assad regime falls, Iran loses its land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They lose their direct access to the Israeli border. So when the Syrian civil war broke out, the IRGC didn't just fight, they created the National Defense Forces, the NDF, in Syria, and they model it directly on their own Basij militia.
So they aren't just exporting influence, they're exporting their actual organizational structure. They're building mini IRGCs in other countries.
Exactly, and that creates lasting influence. Even if the Iranian officers leave, the local structure remains. It's this whole network of proxies that gives Iran strategic depth.
It's impressive, in a Machiavellian sort of way. But I want to pivot back inside Iran. You said the IRGC protects the system, and the system is run by clerics. So how does that relationship actually work? Are the guards just taking orders, or are they running the show?
This is one of the most debated questions. Is Iran a theocracy run by priests, or a military dictatorship run by the guards? And the source uses a historical concept to explain it. The comitatus.
Comitatus. Sounds Roman.
It is. It refers to a warrior retinue sworn to a lord. The key distinction here is that the IRGC is not a Praetorian Guard. A Praetorian Guard, like in Rome, might overthrow the emperor. They become the kingmakers.
Right, they become the ones actually in charge, just swapping out the puppet on the throne.
The comitatus, on the other hand, is defined by absolute devotion. And the argument in the book is that the IRGC is devoted to the supreme leader. It's a symbiotic relationship.
Symbiotic how? I mean, the supreme leader is just one man, an elderly cleric. The guards have the missiles. Why don't they just take over?
Legitimacy. The supreme leader holds the power of the pen, the religious ideological authority. The IRGC holds the power of the sword. The leader needs the guards to stay in power, but the guards need the leader for that religious legitimacy.
Without him, they're just a military junta.
Exactly. With him, they're warriors of Islam, so they're kind of stuck with each other. But that doesn't mean there isn't tension, especially with the elected government, the president, and the parliament.
Right, because the president might want to open it to the West, but the IRGC might see that as a threat to their business interests or their ideology.
Precisely. And this brings us to the concept of the soft war.
The idea that a war isn't just fought with bullets.
After the 2009 Green Movement protests, the IRGC came to a conclusion. They decided the biggest threat to the regime wasn't an American invasion, but a cultural invasion. A soft war engineered by the West to subvert the revolution from within.
So, blue jeans, Hollywood movies, the internet, these are seen as weapons.
In their view, yes. Cultural liberalism is a threat on par with a military invasion. If the youth start loving Western culture, they stop loving the revolution, so they reorganized the Basij. They shifted its focus to cyber warfare, media control, monitoring universities. They're a moral police force because they believe if they lose the culture, they lose everything.
It really hammers home that hybrid entity idea we started with. They're fighting on the battlefield in Syria, but also fighting on the internet and in universities back home.
And that is what makes them so resilient. That's the key takeaway from Ostovar's analysis. If you sanction their economy, they lean on their military might. If you threaten them militarily, they activate their regional proxy network. If you try to stir up dissent, they use the Basij and their media empire to crack down. It's a self-reinforcing system.
So what does this all mean for the listener? I mean, when you're trying to make sense of the headlines from the Middle East.
It means we have to stop looking at the IRGC as just a military. It's become the spine of the Iranian state. It started as this disorganized militia in 1979, just revolutionaries with guns, really. And it's evolved into this massive industrial military complex. It manages the country's strategic depth.
It manages the wars abroad and the politics at home.
It is the dominant institution in Iran.
But here's the question I'm left with. The IRGC has built this huge network based on conflict. They mobilize Shia militias, they fight in Syria, they fight in Iraq. This creates enemies everywhere. Sunni Arab states, the West, Israel.
It does. It completely isolates them and creates a unified front of enemies against them.
So is that sustainable? Can you build a long-term national strategy on perpetual conflict?
And that's the provocative question, isn't it? The IRGC justifies its own existence through conflict. It needs an enemy to protect the revolution from. If those external threats disappear, their massive grip on the economy and politics would be much harder to justify.
Right. Why do we need a military conglomerate running the dams if we aren't at war?
So they might be trapped in a cycle where they need conflict to survive. It's very possible that relying on conflict to justify your existence eventually just drains the state dry. You can win battles, you can keep the regime alive, but can you build a prosperous future at home while doing it? That's the gamble they're taking.
A lot to think about. If you want to dig deeper into all of this, we highly recommend checking out Vanguard of the Imam by Afshon Ostovar. It's a dense read, but incredibly rewarding.
Absolutely. There's so much more in there about the early days in the Iran-Iraq war that we just didn't have time for today.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.